So welcome back, welcome back to the Social Media Race and Community Knowledge Practices Conference. If you're just joining us, this is the first day of our two-day conference, and we encourage you to participate in the conference throughout. We just finished our first session, wonderful session. Now we're about to start our second. Our second presenter will be Dr. Jeffrey Layne Blevins. Dr. Blevins is a professor in the Department of Journalism and the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Cincinnati. He is co-author, his co-author, James Lee, is a Associate University Librarian for Academic Innovation at Northwestern University. Dr. Blevins and Lee are co-authors of Social Media, Social Justice, and the Political Economy of Online Networks. Dr. Blevins will present Social Justice and Cultural Politics on Social Media, a data visualization on Twitter networks from the summer of 2020. So he will present on that. After Dr. Blevins presents, Dr. Angela Zhang will present a comment or provide a comment on his presentation. And just for a moment, Dr. Zhang is an assistant professor at Gaylord College of Journalism here at the University of Oklahoma. And Dr. Zhang received the 2022 Race and Public Relations Award for her research examining corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion in communication. And so now I welcome Dr. Blevins to begin his presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Carlos. I take it everyone can hear me okay. I'll try the share screen. Are you all able to see my PowerPoint deck? Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for that. And I really want to acknowledge the first presentation by Catherine Knight Steele. I took so many notes during that. And in some way, I kind of wish her presentation was after mine, because she might have some more sophisticated answers to some of the questions that we're dealing with. Just a note about the data visualization. Some of them are fairly complicated, so I took most of them out, and I really want to focus on kind of the meaning of what we discovered in doing this study. James had approached me, my co-author, when I was doing a textual analysis of tweets following Ferguson, and said, hey, have you heard of data visualization methodology where we could, really quantify a lot of what you presented here. And he and I have been co-authors ever since. So I certainly want to acknowledge his work as well. I'm going to go to the next slide, if I can. Oops. Is it not letting me switch sides? There we go. Try that one. All right. And we did mention the book. I have the link there if you're interested. Essentially, what I'm going to be presenting is a chapter from that book. And also one more round of acknowledgments. We received generous support for this, primarily from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Cincinnati Project here at UC, as well as towards an open monograph ecosystem through UC's Provost Office. So generally, what we wanted to look at was to question the role of social media and online networks, and particularly in three different areas. And this is kind of how our book is structured. We were first curious about the role of social justice movements and how they engaged social media to, kind of reclaim communicative space. The middle part of the book, we look at the growth of right-wing authoritarianism and how they have also worked in social media and on online networks, and in many ways have thwarted social justice movements. And then finally, we're kind of bringing these two together, looking at the work of social justice movements and right-wing authoritarianism. What is the kind of the net cultural politics as a result of that? So I do want to back up just for a minute and talk about our specific research questions for the book, and particularly the piece that I'm going to focus on here today. And is, what do social and political movements look like on social media? How can we visualize these? And when we visualize, these networks, well, what do we see, in that shape? And then how do political and economic concerns, play out in this space as well? So those were our general research questions, and our primary methodology was to look at the social media network formerly called Twitter. And we were able to not only, count, for instance, the number of hashtags or tweets or retweets, but we were able to build these into visual nodes. So if we had like a very large node, we could build it around, for instance, tweets, retweets, or hashtags. And we could also look at who was, retweeting those posts and what kind of networks were built out of it. And I'll get into a little bit more to the methodology as I go on. So in our first case that we looked at, we started with Ferguson. And what was really interesting about the Ferguson case is that we saw, for instance, the role that social media could play, not only in terms of community journalism and people being able to live stream what was going on during the protest, but the types of conversations that were able to come from that social media activity. Ferguson and Black Lives Matter hashtag, trended on Twitter at this time, and it really it empowered groups to kind of bypass the typical gatekeeping function of the media. So excuse me. When we think about these groups that were, typically they didn't have the kind of communicative power but before. They might be involved in, they might be affected by the events that are going on, in their neighborhood, in their community, but they have to rely on the press, the media to cover them, to get their message out. And Papakarisi refers to these groups as effective publics. They are groups that are affected by what is going on, but typically don't have the same communicative power. And with something like social media, being able to live stream, being able to have these conversations to larger audiences, it affords them more power, if you will. And they were able to produce disruptions of dominant political narratives during this time. And so I want to talk about a few examples of those. So for instance, as the hashtag Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, but particularly Ferguson, trended on Twitter, as well as Hands Up, Don't Shoot. We saw different groups that were, parroting this. They were talking about it, covering it. So I have an image here, for instance, of anchors at CNN news desk replicating the Hands Up, Don't Shoot pose. I have another image of St. Louis Rams football players when they were in St. Louis, when they were introduced for a home game, who came out in that pose when they were announced. And here we have a man in Palestine who is, holding up a sign, with with the hashtag Ferguson and justice, so that this conversation that otherwise, without social media, without this kind of online discourse, might have been confined just to that space, might have just been confined to local news. But here it became a national story and became an international one as well. That Michael Brown wasn't just a shooting victim in St. Louis by a white police officer, but this discussion carried far and wide. So what we wanted to do specifically around this case was to first just look at the hashtags that had trended from the period of time in August after the shooting of Mike Brown by Darren Wilson through December, when the decision was made not to indict him. And we considered these to be triggering events. And so what we did is we categorized hashtags into kind of three schemas. One, what we called places and names. And we consider these to be kind of less interesting, at least at the time, but they were Ferguson Police, Michael Brown, Mike Brown, Darren Wilson, and then Eric Garner was interesting because it was from another similar event, but people began pairing the hashtags together. But so these are again, places and names. Our second group were ideological hashtags. This would be Black Lives Matter, BLM, All Lives Matter, Justice for Mike Brown, and Justice for Michael Brown. And these we considered, ideological in the sense that there is some type of ideological claim that is being made about the event, whether it was, saying, Black Lives Matter or Justice for Mike Brown, or from what we heard typically from the political right of All Lives Matter as a pushback against Black Lives Matter. And then the more interesting hashtags for us were what we considered conceptual hashtags. These are ones where the individual posting made a kind of an individual conceptualization of the event. So for instance, with the hands up, don't shoot pose, people would pick, would include images of themselves with that pose, which, relates to claims by an eyewitness that Michael Brown was trying to surrender with his hands up when he was shot. Or I can't breathe, referring to Eric Gardner and what his famous last words were, or if I was gunned down, or if they gunned me down, where individuals would post images of themselves, that would be two dissimilar images, and wondering which would be publicized in mainstream media if they were the ones that were the victim of a shooting by police. So I want to talk just a bit about that one, and I have a few examples here. One is an individual attired in a cap and gown, something that might be arguably considered pro-social, versus himself in street clothes. We see another image of the same attired in cap and gown and in street clothes. And a third individual who is in his military uniform, and another one in street clothes, maybe smoking a cigarette. And so, the question being, if I were, gunned down, people didn't know my name, which image of me would pervade in public spaces? And this, for us, was certainly the most interesting in that it allowed several kind of conversations to take place. Then in terms of recognizing the personal, it's like, hey, Michael Brown could have been me, particularly if I was a person of color. But we also saw several white individuals who used this hashtag, posted images as well, as a way to acknowledge their own white privilege. So our initial lessons learned were that factual descriptive hashtags, the ones that we found a little less interesting, at least at this part of our study, were the first ones to go viral. But it was the ideological hashtags such as BLM that kind of stood the test of time, if you will, and tended to capture more legacy media attention. Those were the ones that tended to be reported on. What was really interesting is that triggering events, such as the non-indictment of Darren Wilson, the police officer who shot Michael Brown, contributed to more personalization of the event. So it wasn't, the "if they gunned me down" hashtag didn't go viral until much later. And what was also interesting in this case is that there was kind of an amplifying effect, that individuals who were posting about what happened in Ferguson would pair it with the hashtag of Eric Garner, so kind of linking these factual events together. And then finally, again, the conceptual hashtags getting broader engagement from the overall public. Other lessons learned. Our initial part of the study supported Papkarisi's notion of effective publics, but we felt like this early part, deepened our understanding of why particular schemas, why particular hashtags tended to resonate with users, particularly if they gunned me down. And also by telling their own stories on their own terms, effective publics in Ferguson, we're able to move beyond, basic story elements of what happened and whether or not it's just or unjust, to, a personalization of the event, and therefore broadening the discussion in more meaningful ways. So that was the first part of our study. And at this point, we were fairly optimistic about, the empowering role that social media could play for social justice groups. But then the story changed a little bit. For instance, we saw more authoritarian groups that became very active in this space again, particularly during the 2016 election cycle. We covered that in our book as well. I'm going to essentially skip past that for the most part here today. What we found is that fake news tended to generate a lot more engagement, at least in the period following Ferguson during the campaign cycle for president. So that happened on Facebook, for instance. Also during this time, Twitter, when it was still Twitter, discovered a horde of spam accounts originating from Russia and Ukraine, but didn't delete them. There were some, they had economic incentives not to do that. And then we have these companies that vend popularity, if you will. They can essentially help, tweets go viral, whether that's, 500 views or Devumi. So, we were concerned that this might take away from kind of the grassroots, authentic discourse that we were noticing in the Ferguson case. And so that brings us then to the summer of 2020, where we had a string of events, killing of unarmed Blacks by police, or in Ahmaud Arbery's case, essentially a vigilante group. And what we were curious about is there was this momentum from Arbery in February to Breonna Taylor in March, and then finally George Floyd. That okay, we're going to have a large swell, and did have a large swell of engagement about these events in the spring and summer of 2020. But what might have changed with the role of more authoritarian and right-leaning groups during this time. So for instance, one of the things that we noticed when looking at Twitter activity during the 2016 election campaign, just by looking at pro-Hillary Clinton tweets versus pro-Trump tweets, there was actually more pro-Clinton tweets and more pro-Clinton activity. However, the pro-Trump and the MAGA tweets would congeal in these large networks. That we would notice what we call the continent effect, that their group was smaller overall, but they would retweet each other, they would respond to each other's tweets, and they had an interesting use of hashtags of how they would pair them with pro-Clinton tweets. So the idea is if someone was searching for a trending topic, say, for Clinton or I'm with her or some of those types themes, they would also be exposed to an array of pro-Trump and MAGA activity. And the political left, on the other hand, although larger in number, didn't have that type of continent effect. They just existed in these little outlets on the network. And so they really weren't communicating with as a broad a group as the pro-Trump tweets. So we felt like this summer 2020 would be a good case then to look at how this would shape out. So here we changed our schema a little bit in looking at this larger period of time. We had a category for victim names, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. So, this, is essentially, kind of factual information about, who's involved. And then we had two ideological categories, one that we called social justice and the other from the political right. So in the social justice category, we had BLM, police brutality, Black Lives Matter, enough is enough, I can't breathe, say her name, say his name, justice for Breonna Taylor, justice for George Floyd, justice for Ahmaud Arbery. So more than just saying the person's name, but carving out a political or ideological claim. And then on the political right, we counted those hashtags as All Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, Back to Blue, MAGA, CAG, Keep America Great, Trump, and the like. And so, in this case, we were thinking that because of the attention and the boots on the ground protest that these cases had generated, we wanted to see how this would fare on social media that, at least in our view, or on Twitter at this time, was being dominated by the political right. A summary of our findings when we, looked at the hashtags and the networks, we did find that the killings of Arbery, Taylor, and Floyd resonated broadly, more broadly than what we saw even with Ferguson. Secondly, that the victim names as hashtags are often linked to other social justice themes. So here, the political left or social justice groups were, linking hashtags more effectively, perhaps, than what they did in the case of Ferguson, in that way, generating, more traffic. However, what we did find was that specific social justice groups or accounts were not dominant in the network. So it was very similar to what we saw during the election season in 2016, where yes, BLM, ideological social justice hashtags, there were more of them, and there were more accounts producing, pro-social justice measures. They were still in smaller enclaves in the network, while those smaller in number, those from the political right, about Back to Blue and All Lives Matter, were more congealed, and they were still tagging them with pro-social justice themes. And so in a way, you can look at it as manipulating the network, or a term that we used in our study, we called hashtag hijacking. So here, where you specifically take, a hashtag for a theme that you disagree with, and then put your message to it. But at any rate, otherwise, politically fractured networks on the left, they did congeal around. If we just separated out the hashtag Black Lives Matter, they would congeal around this message. But the political right was very actively engaged in counterposing those themes. And so, in terms of the broader level of discourse that was taking place on Twitter during this time, we might question a bit. So to kind of bring this, to a conclusion, we found that political right networks still tend to remain more congealed than the left. What was particularly frustrating in this case is what we saw with these fake accounts, or worse yet, imposter accounts that created a lot of confusion. So, for instance, there was an account called Africa Must Wake. This turned out to be a Russian-generated account, and it displayed all sorts of anger towards white people, and trying to make it look like BLM was an anti-white hate group, if you will. Another example was a white nationalist group that had created an account called Antifa US, and they falsely claimed that responsibility as Antifa for a lot of the violence that was happening in Minneapolis, as well as sending out other types of inflammatory messages. Again, trying to confuse what the meaning of Antifa would be, that, oh, this is another hate group, this is another extremist group, if you will. And that brings me to a point about narrative politics, and that, what are kind of the larger stories that are being told. You might have heard that, the term narrative economics, and it refers to the idea of how these stories, whether true or untrue, can essentially tell a more simple but less accurate story about what is going on in the economy. And we felt this would apply in politics as well, that these viral stories or themes, whether true or false, might affect political beliefs and activity. So in here, instead of the story just being about a broader recognition around social justice and Black lives and the role of police and policing, that it became somewhat of a push by interest on the political right. And it's very different than the types of narrative politics we've seen before. Thinking about, for instance, Obama, who's, had hashtags around hope and change. These were his campaign messages, or yes, we can, right? It was a little more simple, and as well as Trump for Make America Great Again. But or MAGA, we didn't get that with BLM or Black Lives Matter. It was more politically blurred overall. So, and finally then, and I'll use this to wrap up, is that the political economic struggle that is taking place on these online networks can be seen as two opposing forces, where we have social justice groups pushing from the bottom up, but also getting social propaganda from the top down. And unfortunately, we were bothered by these grassroots looking movements that can be manipulated through networking strategies, confounding social justice movements and perhaps confusing the epistemic validity of cultural and political messages on social media. And so with that, I think I should be about 20 minutes and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Blevins, for that presentation. Now I want to invite Dr. Zane to provide a brief comment.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Blevins, for the presentation. This was really an amazing work, and just by listening to the presentation and reading the work, I actually have learned a lot because I do network analysis myself, and I know that how hard it is to organize and structure unstructured data on social media and presenting them in a way that's really meaningful. And I would actually encourage everyone to kind of take a look at the online book. I think I think it's free for everyone, right?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
we have an open access version that is free.
It has a really amazing visualization of the data, network data from both sides, both the left and the right. That's amazing and really been a great way to engage people in conversations, whether it's academia, researchers, or conversations, spark conversations in the classrooms on this topic. And I think that the research is really interesting and especially valuable because we're actually looking at hashtags that are transcending and carry over events, and not just within the US, but also internationally as well. I think that's really interesting, as well as the different types of hashtags, how they will actually encourage different types of conversations and form different communities online. And I think another really valuable point about this research is that it presents both sides of the stories. And I think we had a little bit of a discussion earlier in the first presentation about how the countering forces might be taking up strategies to form these groups and form alternative conversations and discourse. And so I think it's really, really important for us to understand both sides, especially those that are interested in disrupting these processes and movements, how they are actually organizing and networking and communicating and putting together their forces and discourse. So I think that's actually really, really valuable. And I think the presentation as well as the research actually opens up other conversations as well in terms of how can we link networks or hashtags or messages or online discourses with effectiveness of these movements. So whether how they come to different conversations, went more viral, got more engagement, more actions, and eventually sparking real policy changes that can inspire social change. And I think some other questions that are really interesting as well is how does disinformation or information, as well as current social media companies' content regulation policies, how are these going to impact future social justice movements on these platforms? So thank you so much for the presentation. And I think I'll probably open that for my other questions.
Thank you.
And so I want to just pause for a second to see if there are any questions from the audience, from the panelists that they might have for you. I certainly have a question because your work bears directly on questions I've been thinking about, but I don't want to hog the discussion either. So I want to pause.
Dr. Fan has raised her hand.
Okay, I can't. I'm sorry, I didn't see. So if they could go ahead and just ask the question.
Thank you so much. This was a fascinating project, and I really enjoyed learning about the life of hashtags and other elements of communications on social media. I'm from the University of Washington. We have a Center for an Informed Public here that's doing some really exciting work on misinformation and also on policies surrounding intervention by social media companies. And I would love to hear that prong of your work. I know you wanted to focus on one piece, but I'd love to hear about, whether any findings you've had about the impact of companies that have moderated at some points messaging by certain political or ideological groups, the impact, if you study that aspect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's interesting when we look at Twitter, which of course is now X. I had gave a negative example of where they spotted this horde of spam accounts and didn't want to do anything about it because it would affect their value. But after January 6th, Twitter actually got a lot better about managing that. There were certain accounts that they discontinued. We still might question the effectiveness of it. But the intention was, I think, was correct to try to deal with it. But it is kind of a whack-a-mole thing. It's like you don't realize that you have a problem until you have the problem, and then you're kind of responding. And a lot of times, that disinformation, that propaganda is already out there, and it's already had its effect. And of course now, Twitter is X, and Musk is much less inclined to deal with that. So I don't know that honestly that Twitter or X is ever going to be the same, or that we're going to have something like it again. I know Threads, hasn't caught on the same way, and Facebook, for instance, tends to be graying a bit, but they had their own problem with Cambridge Analytica. I would say this though, that trying to deal with this through regulation, I think is going to be impossible, because if we make for instance, these social media networks responsible for defamation or some of this, really bad content. And, so if I say we did away with Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, that immediacy is going to be gone, right? They're not going to be able to publish anything until they have vetted it, if it's as if they are speaking. And so, well, what does that do, to live streaming? What does that do with kind of the immediacy of conversations that are taking place? So, from a journalistic standpoint, I think that would do as much damage as good. I think the best that we can hope for is kind of the whack-a-mole strategy. It's like, you deal with it once it is a problem, but it really is a bit of a Gordian knot.
Dr. Zhang, I'm wondering if you have a follow-up to the question, or even to Dr. Blevins' response.
I kind of agree with what I don't know.
I don't think I got all of it. I'm so sorry. I didn't get out your audio.
Urban basement.
I think Sherry has her hand up.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sherry. Sorry.
And Dr. Zhang, you weren't muted, but your audio has gotten very faint. So I just want to give you a heads up about that. So I'm just wondering, based on the research, where you noted that right-wing groups were kind of they were engaging in different ways, and they were hijacking hashtags, and they had more congealment of activity. Is that a strategy that you would prescribe for other groups that are trying to be more effective? Like, do you just feel like that's a strategy that other groups should also adopt, or do you see reservations in prescribing that strategy? I'm just curious to know your thoughts about that.
Absolutely. And in fact, we have seen I've seen local social justice groups here in Cincinnati used that strategy very effectively. I probably should have included it in my presentation, but I think it was kind of like probably too long as it is. But yeah, so for instance, here in Cincinnati in 2015, we had a University of Cincinnati police officer, white police officer, who shot and killed an unarmed Black motorist, Sam DuBose. And there was a group that formed on campus called the Irate Eight. And they were ostensibly 8% of the student populace then identified as Black or African American. And they wanted a stronger response from the university about this. Like, why do we have a university police officer making traffic stops, for instance, way off of campus? And we had a very popular president of the university then. He's president at University of Michigan now, Santa Ono. And he was, he got a big on social media. And he had a hashtag called Hottest College in America to refer to University of Cincinnati. And so they would hit that hashtag on everything that they posted out on social media, so that, ostensibly someone comes on, it's like, oh, I want to, Hottest College America is trending. And then these messages are showing up in their feed. And it was a very strategic use by their part, to do that. For me, where the kind of the dismay comes in is when we're talking about social justice groups, but talking more about political left groups. They tend to be, at least at the time, I should say, they tended to be more fractured, that there were more disagreements, amongst the group. And so, there was, some disagreement. Well, I'm not retweeting, I'm not engaging in that conversation. Whereas, the MAGA and the political right, they just tend to fall more into the same stream. But it is a strategy I would absolutely recommend.
Thank you. Sherry, are there any other hands raised or questions that have come to you? I just want to make sure we're not missing anyone.
I'm not seeing any just yet.
Okay. Well, I'm going to just ask a question, Dr. Blevins, if it's okay. One of the things that you kind of mentioned here is that, it's these public hashtags, whether it's, hashtag Black Lives Matter, they can be co-opted, but you can also use those hashtags as a means of activism, bringing attention to things that wouldn't necessarily get attention. And so I appreciate that story on the Irate 8. I just want to push you more to talk about how effective, right, online activism, digital activism, vis-a-vis X or Twitter, examples of ones that you've seen besides maybe this Irate 8 that have been really, really not only effective in terms of like drawing people in and getting people to care, but also effective in terms of being able to help push a cause forward in a useful way.
Yeah, and I think that the results are kind of mixed. There's a group here in Cincinnati that I studied pretty closely, and they formed about the same time as Sam DuBose, and they were called Black Lives Matter Cincinnati. They were a locally based group. They had, clear leadership. And they liked using social media. They had a Facebook page and a Twitter account. And then what they liked is that they could control their message. And so they would be an effective public that was very effective for a while. But then they got discouraged when the local press here, didn't rely on them specifically. And so by that, I mean, that if there was a group at courthouse during the trial for the police officer, they would say, oh, here's members of BLM Cincinnati. And, I would talk to the leaders of this group. There's like, none of us were there, as one of the leaders told me, essentially anyone who was Black and angry became a default member of our group. they said, that the press that did the best job of covering them was actually national press that, made sure who was who, would like look them up on social media. But they got so frustrated, particularly with the BLM thing, that they ended up changing their name to, I think, Mass Action for Black Liberation. But they also adapted a much broader, social justice platform. But it made them very loath, though, to talk to the press or to be active outside. They'd say, well, go to our Facebook, go to our Twitter, because that's where their message was locked in stone. But they didn't like being lumped into other groups or having people who part of their group or saying that they're part of the group when they were not, because then they lose control over the message. But it really is, I think, more of a tension with the press. And it's certainly one of the things I really push upon as a journalism professor on my students. So it's a mixed bag of good and bad.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions? I'm just checking.
I have a quick question. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I don't know what's going on with audio. I was wondering, I'm really interested in the hashtag, how you kind of categorize different hashtags in the previous event. And I was wondering if you guys explored how the hashtags impact in forming different networks groups within the social justice movement. If a particular hashtag is more effective in controlling groups online. I was wondering if you looked into that.
That's interesting from the social justice perspective. BLM was the only one, whether it was BLM or Black Lives Matter, that we really saw that kind of congealment. The problem was when we looked at individual accounts, because we wanted to have kind of a check, was like, well, we can't just look at the hashtag as the only measure, because what if someone on the political right is using that hashtag, but then flooding? So you kind of got to really dig down in there. And so when we looked at individual accounts, there was none that was dominant. There we didn't have the kind of continent effects where we certainly saw it on the right, whether it was someone in politics or, sadly, some of these fake accounts or imposter accounts. They were the ones that were more effective in getting that, at least in getting a specific message out. And it kind of ties in, I think, what Carla's question was as well, where we might then question the how effective was it. I think what we saw in summer of 2020, it was just such a moment that it had such broad recognition, but no individual group really on the social justice side had prevailed on that. And if I could use another example too, kind of outside of social justice, is what we saw in the 2016 election campaign, where we saw these this huge continent around Trump. And we thought, okay, well, because he just has so many followers, he was such a, I'll say, phenomenon then, that, well, what if we took him out of the network? And so what we did is we took his account out and then just looked at what was left. And we still saw a very large, continent. And we would just go like, okay, what was the next most popular account? We call these knockout experiments, where it's, my understanding is they do these in DNA research, where you take out part of the DNA and see what effect it has on the rest of the strand. So we would take out various accounts to see what the effect was. And we had to strip out so many, celebrity accounts, political accounts before we could begin to break up that Trump continent. And we didn't see anything like that on, for social justice groups.
Yeah.
And we have about 4 minutes left. And I would just love for you to just, if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Blevins, to maybe reflect on how social media now is generating political discourse, because of, particularly in the example of George Floyd, an image of his killing generates worldwide, right? Worldwide sort of outrage, but it started from social media. And there's a way in which social media then drove that discussion around George Floyd. Can you talk about how maybe political discourse has changed because of social media?
Yeah, I think it's changed in ways good and bad, and the good being, and this is kind of what I meant about, the immediacy of like why we don't necessarily want to regulate this, because what kind of filters, might we have before? I remember there was, I say this to a lot of my, progressive friends who were like, oh, we've got to regulate fake news. We've got to, we've got to regulate, the government needs to regulate this. And I'll be like, okay, but would you want the Trump administration in charge of this? Because all social media is going to be true social at this point, not to be that, that flip about it. But, there's that we have to kind of accept it as it is. On the bad side is that we also saw how effective it was in getting election deniers organized leading up to January 6th. That is essentially how they plotted. They planned. I've talked to a lot of police who monitor social media accounts, and they love that. It's like, wow, you've provided a roadmap for our investigation about who was involved and where they were at the time. I think the other factor is that with like what is going to become the next big social media. I don't think we're going to have anything quite like Twitter. I don't know if TikTok is going to be that, but maybe that's my age showing. In that I have a TikTok account. I've never posted anything, but and I'm both surprised and horrified by some of the things that I see. So
it's getting worse. No, I think you're right. It's complicated. It's very complicated. Well, Dr.
I like
Blevins,
that. It's complicated.
that's my easy answer. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for taking time to answer all our questions. Very much appreciated. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We will break for lunch for about an hour, and we will return at about 1:15 for our next presentation by Dr. Karen Frost Arnold on platform problems, how social media companies obstruct and exploit movements for racial justice. Before I let you go, I want to make sure that Dr. Is Sherry, are you still here? Okay.
I am here.
I want to make sure, sorry, my screen is small. I can't see everyone at the same time. But I want to make sure that there's nothing I left out.
Nope. We will look forward to seeing everybody back. And there's information in the chat about how you can invite folks to join. And we look forward to seeing you in about an hour.
All right. Thank you, everyone.